Let's look at the code of practice for dueling in France in the 19th century. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. Now I was sent some time ago, this has taken me a while to get around to actually, the French dueling code with commentary by Brian House, and the translator, Brian House, actually sent this to me himself some time ago. It's taken me a little bit of a while to get around to it, but it's a really interesting dueling code, essentially a set of rules and regulations for dueling in France in the 1800s, and I thought it'd be interesting to go through some of the details. Obviously I recommend you get the book and read the whole thing. Brian House, incidentally, if you look up online, you'll see that he's translated other things as well, which were probably of interest if this is of interest to you and you're watching this video. So check out Brian House's publications, and thanks to Brian for sending this through to me. So let's look at some interesting details to do with dueling in France in the 19th century. Very briefly, to set a tiny bit of context before we go on, in the 19th century, dueling had become less common, shall we say, than it was in the 18th century in most places. However, France kind of bucked that trend and dueling was still quite, I won't say popular, but in a certain social class, it wasn't completely infrequent, particularly in France and in Italy. But there were other places where dueling happened. In fact, it happened all over Europe to some extent, even England. But there were some places where it was more common, some places where it was less common. More common in France, more common in Italy, also more common in areas where French and Italians dwelled, so in certain parts of South America as well, it has to be said. Most other parts of Europe had sort of laid dueling to the side, although it did often happen, particularly between military class gentlemen still. But nevertheless, civilian men in France in the 19th century still settled matters, by and large, either with a pistol or a sword. Usually the swords used were the equivalent of a small sword, so épée de combat, so the later development of the small sword, a sharp épée, basically like in modern épée fencing, or usually a single shot pistol. Sometimes other weapons were used, and maybe we'll look at that in a future video. And in fact, Brian says in his letter to me here, he says, please find enclosed a copy of my second book, The French Dueling Code with Commentary. This is the first complete translation of the French code into the English language. It was the most widely used code. Most of continental Europe and South America used it, and the most complex, including épée, saber, and pistol. And yeah, there we go. Let's delve into it, and let's find what interesting anecdotes I can turn up. What I will say though is I'm not going to obviously read the whole book. If you want to read the whole thing, then I recommend you go and buy it. Go and find it somewhere and buy it. Or if you can read French, you can probably find the original. But nevertheless, before we delve into that though, a very quick word for the sponsors for this video and the channel. Today's kind sponsors for this video are Historic Mail. Not chainmail, mail. And in this wonderful internet age where we can research lots of historical sources online, we kind of miss that tangible paper feeling of being able to look at historical documents in person until now. Historic Mail is the perfect gift for someone who's got everything and helps you or them re-engage with the lost art of letter writing via the medium of historic letters, real historic letters written by famous historical people, delivered straight to your door. It was a bunch of history enthusiasts who came up with the idea, and it means that you or one of your loved ones can get letters by people like Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Edison delivered straight to your door as if they were writing to you. These letters get delivered straight to your doorstep, or someone who you're giving it to as a gift, and you've got the letter inside, you've got historical context. It's a wonderful gift, and it's a great way of re-engaging with the way that people received information in bygone years. Through these letters you learn things about some of these famous historical people that you've heard about, some little details about their life that you probably didn't know about at all. And Historic Mail also offers an American history pack, which goes from 1776, the founding, all the way through to 1976 and the height of the Cold War, the year I was born incidentally. And that features letters from the likes of George Washington, Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln and more. But also other important American figures like Walt Disney, Tesla and Twain. I'm sure you know that I've been thinking a lot about your troubles during the past month. Troubles, to put it lightly. Historic Mail offers 10 weekly letters delivered once a week for $59.99, so it's a great gift. And there are other options such as packs of 25 letters, 52 letters and so on. So why not surprise the history lovers in your family this holiday season with the perfect gift and enjoy 10% off right now with the holiday season sale. You can go to historicmail.com/scholar to get your discount, your gifts, and help support the channel. So check out this amazing offer. The link's right down below there in the description box. And I hope that either you or your loved ones really enjoy this amazing gift. And thanks once again to Historic Mail for sponsoring this video and the channel. So thanks a lot for sticking with me. Now let's get back to this French dueling code with commentary, kindly donated by Brian House. So before we go into the nitty gritty, it should be mentioned the original of this, that this is translated in English from, dates to 1836, so the year before Queen Victoria came to the throne. And the title was Essai sur le duel, which just means essay on the duel. And it was written by Count Chateauvilliard, I think it probably is. And this became the premier dueling code in France. And you've got to bear in mind that people all over the world at this time, in this social class anyway, spoke French. So it doesn't matter whether you're an English gentleman, Spanish gentleman, Mexican gentleman, you for the most part you've learnt to read French at school because it is literally the lingua franca. That being said, and as Brian House points out, it was translated into other languages and it did become, at least in modified forms, a fairly standard code across a whole bunch of countries. Now, one of the funniest things in the code is actually right at the beginning, and I've mentioned in numerous videos over the years that dueling was illegal. Well, that didn't stop people doing it, and very often we have laws against things because people do them anyway, right? Just the same as in the modern day with certain types of weapon prohibition. But I love the fact that it starts with this. It says, if the dueling code is outside the law, if there can be no code that sanctions it by law, nevertheless, do not hesitate in giving this name to rules imposed by honour, because honour is something no less sacred than government laws. So that's like a really condensed little rant at the fact that, yeah, you can make this illegal, but it's still going to happen, so we'll still have rules for it, and you can't make the rules illegal. I really like that. And the fact is, in the context of the time, regardless of what the laws were, people felt the need, at least in a certain social class, men in a certain social class, felt the need to defend their honour with a sword or a gun, and this was still very much part of the culture regardless of what the law said. Now, I think this is a really, really interesting detail, and this is about who is regarded as the offender, because you've got to bear in mind that within the rules of dueling, and this goes all the way back, we essentially have a person who is regarded as giving the offence and a person who is regarded as responding to the offence. It's never regarded as like equal, like they both had 50% in it. And this is an interesting detail. It says, in a quarrel brought about by a discussion, if an insult occurs, it is the insult that contains the offence. However, if the insult is followed by a blow by either party, then it's the blow that contains the offence. So in other words, if I call you a son of a duck and you say, well, we're going to have a duel about this, I'm regarded as the offender. However, if I call you a son of a duck and you slap me around the face, then that blow is regarded as the offence rather than the fact that I called you son of a duck. It's a weird technical thing, but I guess they had to have a structure for deciding who the offending party was. Now, the code then goes on to give a whole bunch of exceptions and other details about who is the offender. The reason this is important is because, generally speaking, the person who has been given offence to is the person who gets to choose the weapons. And this is obviously a really important practical matter, because if I know that I'm really awesome with a saber, but I'm a terrible shot with a pistol and I'm not very good with a small sword, I'm actually describing myself here. Anyway, then it would be within my interests to go, if I got the choice of the weapon, to go around causing offence to people and going, oh, by the way, that duel that you've just challenged me to, we're going to do it with sabers. And that would obviously be corrupt, because I'd be able to anticipate, you know, I'd be able to start duels from a position of confidence. Whereas it makes far more sense for the person who is kind of innocent or has been given offence to choose the weapons, because that undermines my confidence in challenging people to duels. So I'm unlikely to, if I'm a terrible shot with a pistol and terrible with a small sword or épée, then I'm unlikely to go up and, to call someone a son of a duck, knowing that they will know I'm a crap shot and they might be a really good shot and they'll pick a pistol. So there we go. It's a very important thing, but there's lots more details in the book, so I suggest you read that if you get the chance. It's actually very, very interesting, and it's obviously very closely related to how legal frameworks are worked out. It's kind of a law, but for fighting. Now the next section, it goes on to the types of weapons. Now it's interesting, for this particular code, there are three distinct weapons that you can choose from. The épée, which, as I've mentioned, if you don't know, it looks, at this period, looks pretty much like a modern Olympic épée, but it has a sharp point. It's a descendant of the small sword, but has usually a longer blade and a bigger guard, and it doesn't have finger rings, so different kind of hilt, similar purpose. So the épée, thrust-only sword, it cannot cut. The pistol, and at this date, this is a muzzle-loaded single shot pistol. One shot, sometimes there'd be a brace of pistols, but they would be single shot pistols. And at this date, they could be either flintlock or percussion lock. So in 1836, the percussion system had been around for a little while, a couple of decades, actually literally, but it had only been common for about 5 or 10 years, and a lot of people were still using flintlocks. But of course, bear in mind, 1836 this came out. This continued in use throughout the 19th century, so still single-shot percussion lock pistols would have been the normal pistols. Difference between flintlock and percussion lock: percussion's more reliable, but once they're loaded, if they both work as they should, no real difference in aiming and stuff like that. Some people would point out there's a slight delay with flintlock. There shouldn't be if you load with the correct powder and you've got a good pistol. I know people who shoot flintlocks regularly, and I shoot percussion lock. If they're working well, they work as well as percussion lock. Right, so, and the third one is saber. Now I think that's really interesting because I wasn't expecting to see that in here. So the three weapons of choice are épée, pistol, or saber. And worth mentioning, of course, that saber in a French context, or indeed a lot of Europe, simply means a cut and thrust sword. Doesn't necessarily mean it's curved. It could be straight or very slightly curved. It's just a cut and thrust sword, as opposed to the épée, which is a thrust only sword. Now, an interesting detail about the saber in the code is that if saber is proposed, saber can be refused. And it says the saber may be refused even by the party that gave offence, especially if he's a retired officer. I think that's kind of curious, and I don't fully understand that. And the saber may always be refused by a civilian. So there we go. There is a special rule for saber in the dueling code. Didn't know that. It goes into some detail about how the summons for a duel should be given, and also the rules around seconds. I won't go into that. I suggest you check out the book if you want to learn about that stuff. But next it goes into specifically the épée duel. Now, some really interesting preliminary points about the épée duel. One of those is you're not allowed to talk to the other person beforehand. You have to go through your intermediaries. But this is curious, and I didn't know this either. So about distance. It says that the distance that they start at, the two adversaries, will be 2 feet apart from the points of the adversary's épées. So with an arm outstretched and with the sword outstretched, the tips must be 2 feet apart from each other. That, I would interpret, I would infer, is to prevent someone from doing a surprise attack. It's you start far apart, but not crazy far apart, but far enough apart that you can't quite reach a person with a single lunge. And of course, the placement of the adversaries has to be fair in terms of the footing, you know, not one uphill or downhill. No, we don't want anyone having the high ground, but equally things like sun in the eyes, or, you know, wet, muddy ground, or that kind of stuff. So it has to be equal. Now, I thought this was a super interesting point because I always try and impress upon my viewers that épées are thrust-only weapons, as some kind of real small swords were, and as some rapiers were. Not all rapiers had edges, but the épée, of course, is a weapon devised purely for the duel, for fairness, and as a thrust-only weapon. And this actually explicitly says the edges of the épée will not be sharp or nicked under any circumstances. In other words, so bear in mind this is potentially a duel to first blood if the blood is enough to satisfy the end of the duel, although sometimes it was to the death. But if you wanted to draw blood on your opponent, an easy way, if the opponent's only expecting thrusts, it would be to nick either surreptitiously or beforehand. Put a little nick or like a notch in your edge, because if you raked that across someone's face, you could tear open their face. It's not going to do them any life-threatening injury, but it'd be enough to cause lots of blood, and that obviously would affect the outcome of the duel. So I absolutely love that detail is in there. Now, another detail I absolutely love is the fact that you must remove your coats and be bare-chested. Because, and it's interesting because people must have done this for them to bring this rule in, to show that you've got no hidden defences. Because let's face it, if you had a very fine male shirt on, or some other type of essentially surreptitious body armour in your coat, obviously that would be a colossal advantage in the duel and massively cheating. And I can bet you that they brought this rule in because at some point someone went, oh well, we can just do it in our jackets. If we're both in the jackets, it's the same thing. And they'd had some kind of lining put inside the jacket. So I would, if I could get away with it, a male shirt, for example, inside the lining of the jacket. So I think that's absolutely cool having that in there. And we know, in fact, in history, with the Medici in their episodes in India and this kind of stuff, where hidden armour was used as a counter-assassination thing. So absolutely would be very effective. So you have to have a rule to prevent it. Now, by slight way of review, Brian House has added in commentary in here. I'm not going to read that because that wouldn't be fair to Brian, but it's interesting and it's great that he's added that. So this isn't simply a translation of the original French text. Brian House himself is obviously a fencer, and he has added in commentary under a lot of these points. I have to say, I don't 100% agree with all of the commentary, based on my knowledge of antiques. And so at one point he talks about the fact of choosing certain épées, and he talks about bell guards. My understanding is that in 1836 no épées really had large bell guards yet. They evolved later on, and we've talked about this in previous videos. I did one with Gavin where we looked at the épée de combat. If you haven't seen that already, check that out because you get more detail about these weapons there. But nevertheless, it doesn't matter that I don't fully disagree. It's great that Brian has put in this commentary between the translated parts, so it adds a lot more value to the book as a whole. Now, there's a really nice point, and obviously I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I recommend you read the book yourself, but I'm just picking out things that are of particular interest to me and I think might be to my viewers here. And one of those is point 15 of the épée section, where it says, if one of the adversaries deflects the other's blade with his left hand, without the agreed use of the left hand, then the witness of the adversary whose blade has been deflected can request that his arm be tied to prevent further use. That's great, so long as the use of the left hand didn't just enable you to run the other person through the body. Yikes. But the basic point here is you're not supposed to use the offhand. Now, you may have looked at modern Olympic or FIE fencing and wondered why they don't use their left hands. In small sword fencing, you absolutely use the left hand. You use the left hand for deflecting incoming points, thrusts, use it for grabbing, for grappling, disarming, punching, anything, throws, trips, anything you want in real small sword fencing. In modern foil and épée, and indeed sabre, you don't use the left hand. And that comes from these rules. You must only use the weapon arm and the sword for this duel, for this type of duel. Unless, and that's interesting, they have agreed the use of the left hand. So it was possible to agree it, but it wasn't at all normal, hence this rule. So it's a massive advantage using the left hand. And the fact is, especially with thrusting weapons like an épée, it's got no edges to worry about. You can even grab the thing. So if someone thrusts it at your body and you sweep it aside with your left hand at the same time as running them through the throat, you've just killed them, or probably killed them, certainly finished the fight, and everyone goes, hey, you used your left hand. Presumably, therefore, you get accused of murder because you hadn't observed the correct rules of the duel. But nevertheless, you'd still be alive and they'd be dead. So something to be aware of if you ever find yourself in an épée duel. So next up, let's look at the pistol duel. And it just so happens I have a French pistol of about the right period here. So I'll just take that off full cock. So this is a smoothbore percussion lock muzzle loading single shot French officer's pistol that could also be used for a duel. And in fact, this is exactly the type of pistol that could have been used in these duels. So they specify certain things. So the duel is to happen between 15 and 35 paces, so yards. Not to be closer than 15 yards. 15 yards with a pistol is, I think, what a lot of people probably shoot on ranges, on indoor ranges at. So, you know, it's not that difficult to hit a target at that range, but they don't want you any closer than that. So it seems that the combination of the distance and the fact that they prefer a smooth bore rather than a rifled barrel suggests that they're trying to reduce the chances of mutually assured destruction. So as mentioned, this pistol is smooth bore, fairly large as well, probably, oh gosh, about 7.7 caliber, I would imagine. This is percussion lock. So essentially the method of loading is you put powder, ball, wadding, ram it down so it's nice and tight, so when you turn the barrel upside down, everything doesn't fall out. And then you take the protector off the nipple, you put a percussion cap on there, and it's ready to go. It's now loaded in imaginary things. There's no safety catch. You've got sights, you've got a rear sight and a foresight, and it talks about the pistols being well sighted and being equal, of course, as well, and not having barrels over a certain length. So they're all about fairness here, and I think there's a hint there of trying to reduce the chances of double kills. Now, amongst the many interesting details in this code, one of the interesting ones I think is that both pistols have to be loaded in front of the other party, and it should be completely patently obvious why this is the case, because you don't want there to be any foul play and any nefarious activity in the loading of one of the person's pistols. You don't want to be loading it with shot rather than ball. You don't want to be giving someone a fake ball that's made of wax or some weird kind of, I don't know, all sorts of things. I'm sure people tried to dream up of ways of basically making sure that they won the duel. So it has to be fair all along. So this is about matched pairs of pistols. Even when a person's using their own pistol, it has to be by common consent, and that has to be inspected and stuff like that. So absolutely to do with fairness, obviously. Now, one of the things about pistol duels that I wasn't really aware of before delving into this code was that there were a number of different formats for the pistol duel, and these were all codified and sort of recognized around the world. They've split down into these categories. So there's the stationary pistol duel, where you basically stand there and aim at each other. There's the at-will pistol duel, the walking pistol duel, the interrupted walking pistol duel, the parallel line pistol duel, and the pistol duel by signal. And essentially these all relate to whether you are moving, where you start off, where you're allowed to move to, when you're allowed to shoot, and all little details like this. And I mean, don't imagine Ridley Scott's The Duelists running around a forest here. It's not as extreme as that. But, you know, I guess we've all seen the sort of walking away from each other and then turning around, raising the arm and shooting, which I think is the at-will pistol duel. But there's some which is given by signal and this kind of stuff. So these are all little details and all with their own separate rules. And generally speaking, it would be the offended party who'd choose which of these they would, you know, if you called me the son of a duck, I'd say, right, I will see you next week, next Wednesday at dawn, and we will have a walking pistol duel with pistols that I provide. So, you know, it was very, very codified. Now, because the variations between these in some cases are quite small, I'm not going to go through all of them. But possibly if there's an appetite for it, I could look just at pistol dueling in a future video, and we could look a little bit more at the pistols themselves as well. But for the purposes of this video, let's move on to the saber duel. So one of the first things we encounter in the saber duel, I grabbed a saber here, okay, it's a British Royal Navy one, but nevertheless it's of the correct kind of period as this. One of the interesting things that immediately comes up with the saber duel is essentially there are two types. There's one with points allowed, with pointy ends, and one without pointy ends. We'll come on to that, we'll come on to the non-pointy one afterwards. But it says here that as far as possible, the use of curved sabres is encouraged as they are less deadly. Now that's going to make a whole load of curved sword people raging. What do they mean by that? I think fundamentally they mean because you're less likely to land successful or deep thrusts. Now this actually is only slightly curved. So when they say curved, they're talking about curved like 1796 like cavalry sabres, or the French equivalent like cavalry sabres. So they're talking about really curved slashing swords, basically because you're more likely to chop each other up and less likely to run each other through, which I think by itself is an interesting fact. So another interesting point that comes up in this is that it says that for this duel, crispin gloves are normally worn. Now, it says, in fact, I'll come back to that in a second. If the insult is covered under Article 11 of Chapter 1, the insulted party can determine whether crispin gloves will be used or not. Regardless, everyone has the right to an ordinary glove or to wrap their hand with a handkerchief. The ends of the handkerchief must not be hanging down. Now that's super, super interesting. I didn't know that was in the rules and regulations at all. So fundamentally, so what are crispin gloves? Essentially, they are leather cuffed gloves, like leather gauntlets. So essentially, the normal kind of protocol is that with sabres being cut and thrust swords and the hands being relatively vulnerable, you wear leather gloves with a long, stiff leather cuff on them, like a fencing glove, basically, but kind of fairly beefy, a bit like almost like cavalry riding gauntlets. That actually means that the fight has to land on a more vital target, or at least a deeper target. You can't just slash someone across the hand or across the wrist necessarily and put them out of action. It means that you've got to go for further up the arm or the torso or the head or something like this. Because as anybody who fences with sabres can tell you, and I can verify, a lot of accidental little hits happen on the hand in fencing, which due to the protective equipment, we kind of go, oh, you know, you kind of brush me there, like it. You parry up here, bounces off, skips off the guard, and slightly grazes your knuckle. Now, if you're wearing gloves, it's not really going to do much. If you're not wearing gloves, it's going to do quite a lot. So I think it's really, really interesting that there's the choice there to either wear such a gauntlet or not, and if not, then nevertheless you can still wear a basic glove and wrap a handkerchief around your arm. So interesting they're thinking about all these details. Now obviously the weapons used have to be the same length for fairness. However, there's an interesting detail which says that if they are not of exactly the same length, if they're too different, then you can't use them. But if they're slightly different, then they essentially draw lots. So like flip a coin to find out who gets the slightly longer one. Now by and large, a lot of the rules for the sabre are pretty much exactly the same as for the épée, particularly around where we come to wounding. But I just thought I'd share some of that with you. So it says when one of the combatants is wounded, his witnesses must stop the combat until they're satisfied that he can start again. So if someone's incapacitated, then that's it, he's lost, but you can choose to carry on essentially. And it says that if no one has been injured but a witness wishes to stop the combat, he'll signal to his opposing witness by raising his cane or sabre in the air, which they've got to bring to signal. And they will give consent, the other witness will give consent by returning the signal. And it also, this was super interesting to me, because again, this was something I didn't know. The witnesses can agree in advance of the duel if it's going to be stopped at the first or the second blood. Now, I've never even heard about second blood before, but apparently that's the thing. And there are various things that can decide which of those you'd choose. But second blood, so I know that lots of duels were done to first blood, but very interesting that duels were done to second blood. And that's given me all sorts of ideas for some things that we can play with in HEMA sparring and fencing games, to maybe not stopping on the first hit, but stopping on the second hit given on one individual. Might lead to some interesting different dynamics to the fight. A bit like continuous fighting, but only up to the second hit. So now onto the sabre duel without points. In other words, we're just slashing at each other now. And this is presumably a safer type of duel. And I must say, actually, I have encountered during my antique dealing life antique sabres which were edged and which had the points removed, so I presume that was precisely for this purpose. And there's an interesting detail here. It says the weapons must be of the same type and unknown to the two combatants. So a bit like when you turn up to a tournament and have the weapons provided for you. However, if the combatants are from the same regiment, then they may use their own sabres, provided, so military sabers, provided they are of the same type and mountings. Actually, no, thinking about it, so these are pointless sabers, so these wouldn't be their military sabers. These would be just the same type of sabers. It's an interesting little detail, and that requires unpacking a bit. I think I'll need to think a bit more on that, on the implications, but I guess if they're from the same regiment, then they've got a different set of rules for the protocols. Actually, coming back to this point, there's a further point which actually clarifies this, and it says that they essentially have to agree to not use the points of their saber. So that is implying that sometimes they were using their own regimental swords with points, but they had absolutely agreed to not thrust. So now we do know that, and this is a comment that Brian House actually makes, we do know that there were sabres with the points ground off, presumably to get rid of that potential risk. But nevertheless, the fact that it's in the code suggests that sometimes they were using pointed sabres, they were just agreeing not to use the points. And contrary to the saber duel with points, an interesting point that's made in this is that indeed this type of duel, so no thrusting saber duel, was normally done to first blood. And as soon as first blood was scored anywhere on the body, then the fight was stopped at that point. Now, I do recommend, if you're interested in this stuff, you go and get Brian House's book, which once again is called The French Dueling Code with Commentary. And it does have a section, it's got various bits at the end, which I won't go into in this video, but one of them is, for example, exceptional duels. And one of those is mounted combat, where sabres usually would be used from horseback, like you see in the duelists. But it's an absolutely fascinating book. I'm going to be reading it a bit more carefully because I've got to say there are things in here which I did not know, and it made me realise I need to learn a lot more about dueling, given that I talk about it quite a bit. So anyway, I'm going to delve into this, learn it a bit more, but I do recommend you check that book out. And I hope this has been an interesting, informative and enjoyable video. I have been your host, Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. I hope I see you back on the channel really, really soon. And take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.